All right, now that we understand factors and factor operators, how do we evaluate a single term? So first of all, I want us to be able to identify factors within a term. So factors in a term are separated by multiplication and grouping symbols. So when I look for factors, basically I can see them as I look for terms. Terms are separated by plus or minus outside of grouping symbols. And if you notice this first one, -2 and then square root of 25, well, if there's nothing between the operator, then it's multiplication between there. So the two factors are going to be a -2, and then the other factor is the operator, the square root of 25. So we're not evaluating, we're just looking for the separate factors. The next term, again, if you look at this dot this raised dot signifies multiplication. So this is one term again. There's no plus or minus outside of grouping symbols or factor operators. So the factors are -5 times 7. So -5 is a factor, times 7. So 7 is a factor. And then the absolute value of -2 is another factor. So I actually have three factors for that term. The next term, again, all the plus or minuses are inside grouping symbols. If I look at the grouping symbols, I have parentheses here. Absolute value is a grouping symbol, and then the square root sign is a grouping symbol. So those all signify factors. So this again is one term, and -2 cubed, now the 3 is repeated factors, right? So I could list this as 3 factors of -2. Then I have that the absolute value as one of the factors, and then the square root as the other factor. So I actually have 5 factors in this one. So I have to be careful with the exponents. Now when I'm evaluating, once I see my factors, then to evaluate, I'm going to have to multiply. So I just need to go back through and remind yourselves how to multiply sine numbers. So as an example, say you're going to multiply +2 times +3. So these are both positive. Well, we can think of this as repeated addition. This could be adding two values of 3 or 3 values of 2. But when we multiply those together, we get 6. And what if we were both negative, like -4 times -5? So these are both negative, but I'll get back to that if we look at multiplying opposite signs first. So let's look at, we multiplied, say, a negative um, 2 times +7. So we actually could think of this then, instead of repeated addition, we could think of it as repeated subtraction. So we could repeatedly subtract two 7s. So kind of this would look like, uh, subtracting a 7 and subtracting a 7. Um, so two -7s combined would be -14. So we could think of this then and multiply this, we get a -14. So it doesn't matter what order, but if the signs are opposite, if you have opposite um, factors like 5 times -2, we could think of it as just adding up a bunch of negative numbers or combining a bunch of negative numbers. This might be 5 terms of -2. So that's -2 . So we could think of it as 5 times negative 2 would be negative 10. So maybe 5 negative 2's combined together, they're all negative, so we would just add them up. So then opposites, if we have a negative 4 times negative 5, it's like subtracting a negative, or the opposite of negative 5 4 times. And every time I take the opposite of negative 5, I actually get 5 plus 5 plus 5, and that would be 4 times. So it actually turns out to be positive. So if I multiply negative 4 and negative 5, I get a positive number, 20. So if I multiply same sign factors, the answer is going to be positive. If I multiply opposite sign factors, the answer will always be negative. So I just need to remind myself when I do multiplication of these. So make sure you watch out. If you have negative 4 and negative 5 as separate terms, you're combining two separate terms. So when I combine a negative 4 and negative 5, they're both negative, so I can combine these to get negative 9. But if they're factors, negative 4 times negative 5, now I'm multiplying factors. The answer to this will always be positive, in this case 20. So you just have to be careful with negative terms and negative factors. Make sure you use your composition to identify before you calculate. So let's go down and now practice this. How do we evaluate a single term? So a couple of key things is the value of a term is the product of its factor values. So the key concept here is I can multiply factors in any order, but I'm trying to multiply the factor values together that are convenient. So we need to identify factors of separate terms, calculate the value of the factors, and then multiply those values together. So if I'm going to calculate the value of these terms, I need to identify the factors and then find each factor value in any order. So negative 2 square root of 25 is one term. And I know it has two factors. It's got a factor of negative 2, and then this factor of the square root of 25. Well, what I want before I calculate or any multiplication, I want the value of that factor. So I'm going to change the square root of 25 to a factor of 5. Now I have my factor values. And now, once I have my factor values, you can go ahead and multiply to get the value of that term. So I hope it makes sense. Before I can understand the value of the term, I need to know the value of every factor in the term. So the next term, again, this is one term. There is no plus or minus outside of parentheses. So I'm just looking for and recognizing factors. So we have the opposite of negative 2. So this is one factor here. I want to know its factor value, and I'm just going to put a set of parentheses there for the value of that factor. The square root of 9 is another factor. This square root of 9 involves another factor, so I'm just going to use parentheses again to leave room or to understand that I need that factor value. The absolute value of negative 2 is another factor. I want the factor value. And then the last factor is a negative 3. So that has no operation on it. So if I go through, the opposite of negative 2 is 2. This factor value would be 2. The square root of 9 is 3. And then the absolute value of negative 2 is 2. So once I have my factor values, I can just start multiplying the factors together. 2 times 3 is 6. 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. 6 times negative 6 is finally negative 36. So again, I need to know all the factor values before I can start multiplying. All right, again, identifying the factors. So I have parentheses to the third power. And then this we could represent as three separate factors, or we could take it together and evaluate it as one. The absolute value is grouped. I know I want the value of that factor to keep track of. I have factor values here. And then the square root of 29 minus, or 25 minus 9, I want that factor value too. So negative 2 cubed, I want that factor value. Well, that's negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. And if I multiply those together, I get negative 8. The next factor, this absolute value, so before I can take the absolute value, I want to evaluate inside 7 minus, or 7 and negative 9 is negative 2. And now the absolute value of negative 2 is a factor of 2. This would be the square root of 16. So before I can take the square root, I need to know the value inside. The square root of 16 is 4. So I have all my factor values. Now I can just multiply the factors together. 2 times 4 is 8. Negative 8 times positive 8 would give me a value of negative 64. And then finally, the last one. Again, we're just going to try and keep track of the factors. How many factors do we have? How many values do we need to basically multiply to get the term? So again, this is one term. And what are the factors? Identifying the factors. So it starts out with the opposite of with parentheses. So let's get that factor value right now. That's going to be a factor of 5. The square root of 4 is the next factor. The factor value would be 2 if I take the square root of that. The absolute value is signifying another factor. So this is the absolute value of negative 4. So the value of that factor is positive 4. And then finally I have parentheses squared. So negative 2 squared is negative 2 times negative 2. So the value of that factor is 4. So now we can just start multiplying, and you can multiply these in any order. So anytime I see like 5 times 2, I get 10, a factor of 10. It's probably the easiest factors to work with. 4 times 4 is 16, and 10 times 16 is 160. So the term value, you notice I'm using blue, the term value then is 160. Okay, so keeping track of factors, finding all the factor values, and then multiplying in any order to get the term value.